The death penalty in the United States is a subject of intense debate, yet one aspect often overlooked is the small but significant population of women on death row. While men make up the vast majority of death row inmates, women sentenced to execution face unique legal, psychological, and social challenges. Who are these women? What crimes led to their convictions? And what factors influence the slow, agonizing wait for execution? Body: Christy Michelle Scott. State: Alabama. Date of sentence: August 5, 2009. Christy Michelle Scott was convicted of the arson murder of her autistic son. On August 16, 2008, she called the police through her neighbor to report a fire in her house. The firefighters retrieved the body of Mason Scott from the house, and he was declared dead. During this time, it was not known that Scott had something to do with the fire. About a month after the incident, Scott surrendered herself to the police. She was charged with the murder of her son on September 30, 2008. She gave Mason cough syrup to keep him asleep before starting the fire. The smoke detector that could have alerted Mason was also missing, indicating that it had been removed deliberately. The autopsy result revealed that Mason had been alive while the fire was ongoing. He died of smoke inhalation and thermal burns. The investigation further revealed that Scott killed her son, who was 6 years old at the time, to claim the $100,000 insurance money she bought a day before the crime. She had also bought an insurance policy for her other son months before. Her younger son survived the fire. Further investigations also showed that this was not the first time Scott would start a fire. At her father's house, her grandparents, and even her home had been on fire more than once. Her trial began at the Franklin County Circuit Court on June 12, 2009. Scott denied the accusations, stating that she was innocent and never intended to kill her son. She claimed not to know how the fire had started. However, she was found guilty of 3 counts of capital murder on July 8, 2009. Each of these charges carried penalties of death or life imprisonment without parole. The jury initially recommended the latter. However, the decision was not conclusive. On later consideration, the case was re-examined, and on August 9, 2009, Judge Terry Dempsey gave his verdict. He believed Scott putting her 6-year-old son through that ordeal was heinous and shouldn't receive a light sentence. He said imposing the death sentence on Scott was the only right thing to do for justice to be served. On that day, she was sentenced to death by lethal injection. After receiving the sentence, she was moved to Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women and became the 3rd woman condemned to death row since 2002. She had submitted several appeals to the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals and the U.S. Supreme Court, but all her appeals have been rejected. She is currently incarcerated on death row at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women. Her execution date hasn't been decided. Lisa Graham, State, Alabama, date of sentence March 2015. Lisa Leanne Graham was sentenced to death for hiring a man to kill her daughter. The man, Kenneth Walton, was a family friend who had worked with the Grahams. On July 2007, she met with Walton and lent him her pistol to kill Shay. Later that day, Walton met with Shay. He took her on a long night drive. He shot her multiple times when she got up, left her body by the road, and drove off. Ehrlich Dinkins discovered Shay Graham's nude body by the side of the road on July 5, 2007. He called 911 and the body was retrieved. Upon examination, Dr. Bordeaux, a pathologist at the Alabama Forensic Service, declared that Shay died of multiple gunshot wounds. She had been shot 6 times. In his words, there was a close-range gunshot wound which had entered the right eye and obliterated the right eye in orbit. The bullet went through the head and exited the back of the head. There was another gunshot wound to the head at the back right side of the head, which entered the skull and exited over on the left side of the head. There was, in addition, a gunshot wound in the chest and exited the back. It perforated the lung, and the top part of the liver on its way through. There were 2 gunshot wounds in the abdomen, one in the upper right abdomen, which lacerated the liver again and then exited the back. The second gunshot wound to the abdomen just went through the skin on the right-hand side. Kevin Graham, Shay Graham's dad, informed the police upon hearing about the death of his daughter. He believed that Kenneth Walton was probably responsible. This was because Walton had told him on 2 occasions that Lisa Graham had asked him to kill Shay. Kevin also stated that he had given Lisa a gun, which she kept in her car. Witnesses also saw Shay leaving the gas station with Walton, so the investigation quickly turned to him. He mentioned Lisa's involvement immediately. Graham killed her daughter because she was afraid Shay would skip out on a $100,000 bond that she had secured for her release from jail on charges stemming from a drive-by shooting in Columbus. Witnesses also said she had claimed her daughter was ruining her life and wanted her out of the picture. It was only after 5 years that the case came to trial. Her first trial ended in a mistrial, and she had to be tried the second time. She was convicted of capital murder on the second trial. Neighbors also testified that they had heard Graham talk about killing Shay, and she had asked some of them if they would do it for her. Walton pleaded guilty on June 14, 2012, and was sentenced to life imprisonment. Graham's case remained in trial. After several appeals were rejected, the jury found Graham guilty of capital murder. She was convicted of murder in Russell County Circuit Court in March 2015. The jury recommended, by a vote of 10-2, sentenced her to death. Samantha Allen, State, Arizona. Date of sentence, August 7, 2017. Samantha and her husband, John Allen, were arrested on July 27, 2011 for the murder of Amy Deal, Samantha's cousin. Before the arrest, Amy had faced several abuse from her family. Her mother claimed her husband's family treated her like a slave and sent her out of the house. She left Amy and her 2 other siblings with her husband, David Martin Deal, who lived with his mother and sister. His niece Samantha and her husband also lived in the house with other children. Neighbors reported that the children in that house were always unkempt, barefooted, barely had clothes on, and they were seen in the neighborhood even late at night. Several reports have been made to the authorities on various incidents of notable abuse of the children, especially Amy. From her school, there have been reports on how dirty she and her sibling were, and sometimes she had gone to school with cat urine on her shoes and had head lice. She had been punished by making her walk barefooted on the hot pavement. She had been made to sleep on the bare floor without bedding as punishment for bedwetting. She was beaten and forced to eat dog feces. Amy was especially abused and the scapegoat of the family. She was maltreated, and even the other children in the house got her into trouble. On July 12, 2011, she was found dead in a small plastic footlocker placed in a hot garage. All the children were made to agree to give a statement that Amy had entered the trunk herself while playing hide-and-seek when others had gone to bed. The bruises on her body made their testimonies untrustworthy. On further probings, Samantha and John Allen confessed to having locked her in the trunk for taking a popsicle without permission. She was made to do jumping jacks and run around for about an hour before she was forced into the footlocker. The trunk was small for her size and must have been squeezed in before Samantha and her husband locked it with a padlock. She died of suffocation, dehydration, and extreme heat. The adults in the house, Samantha and her husband, her mother Cynthia, and Amy's grandmother Judith, were all arrested and charged with murder, negligent, intentional, and conspiracy to child abuse. On August 7, 2017, Samantha Allen and her husband John Allen were sentenced to death by lethal injection for the charge of first-degree murder. She was also sentenced to 74 years imprisonment for the child abuse and conspiracy to commit child abuse charges. In 2022, the Arizona Supreme Court has sustained her charges, and she will still face the death penalty for murdering her 10-year-old niece. Heather Keaton, State, Alabama. Date of sentence, August 20th, 2015. Heather Lievel Keaton, born in 1988, was involved in the murder of the DeBlas children. Together with her husband, John DeBlas, she was found guilty of the death of Natalie and Chase DeBase. John DeBlas divorced his wife and gained custody of their children. Shortly after, he met and married Heather. The report showed that she mistreated the children, who were just toddlers. She would scream at them in public and mishandle them. At a friend's event, a friend had reported her ill treatment of the child and even claimed to have threatened to report to the police if she continued. However, the mistreatment continues. DeBlas seemed to support his wife's treatment of his children and contributed to it. On March 4, 2010, Heather, with her husband's support, gauged Natalie with tape and locked her in a suitcase in a closet. Natalie was 4 years old at the time and was also poisoned with antifreeze. She died after, and the couple disposed of her body. Similarly, on June 20, 2010, Heather gauged Chase by taping his hands to his legs and strapping an object to his back. He was poisoned with antifreeze also and reportedly made to stand in a corner overnight. He also died, and the couple disposed of his body. The deaths of these children weren't discovered until later in the year because the couple moved from Alabama to Kentucky. In November 2010, the couple got into an argument, and Heather's mother overheard them. She suspected they must have done something to the children and sought counsel. Eventually, Heather was brought in for questioning, and she explained that DeBlas had been abusing the children. Investigations began, and both Heather and DeBlas were found guilty of child abuse. In December, Natalie and Chase's remains were found in Alabama and Mississippi, respectively. An autopsy couldn't trace the exact cause of their death, but pathologists determined that it was a case of homicidal violence. In December 2010, DeBlas was charged with abuse of a corpse and aggravated assault. Days later, he was charged with 2 counts of felony murder and 2 counts of corpse abuse. In January 2011, Heather was originally charged with 2 counts each of aggravated child abuse and abuse of a corpse. Later, Mobile County District Attorney John Tyson Jr. upgraded her charges to capital murder, but Heather pleaded not guilty to the murder charges. On January 8, 2015, DeBlas was sentenced to death by lethal injection. He is currently awaiting execution. In the same vein, on August 20, 2015, Heather was sentenced to death by lethal injection for the murder of Chase and 20 years in jail for the manslaughter of Natalie. Heather was the first woman to receive the death penalty in Mobile County. Despite numerous appeals, she is currently incarcerated at the Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women on death row. Her execution hasn't been scheduled. Tanya Nelson, State, California, date of sentence, April 23, 2010. Tanya Nelson was found guilty for robbery in the murder of a fortune teller and her daughter. Nelson had consulted the fortune teller, Ha Jade Smith, to help her get her ex-lover back, who happened to be her husband's brother. Her brother-in-law had ended their illicit relationship, but that didn't go down well with Nelson. Like most Vietnamese American, she was used to consulting fortune tellers. However, on this issue, Smith couldn't help her. The fortune teller saw no possibility of her coming back together with her ex, so she told Nelson to accept the reality and move on. This counsel infuriated Nelson, and she promised to drive across the country to kill the fortune teller. Prosecutors even told the jury that Nelson tried to get her son to kill her brother-in-law's wife after the affair ended. True to her word, Nelson, together with an accomplice, Philippe Zamora, traveled down to Orange County to perpetrate the crime. On April 23, 2003, Smith and her daughter, Anita Vo, were stabbed about 10 times. White paint was poured over their faces and hands to cover the crime. She also stole Smith's expensive jewelry. She assumed Smith's identity after her death to purchase $3,000 in clothing and plane tickets for a family vacation in Southern California. When she was arrested, Smith's credit cards and other items were found in her possession. In March 2010, a jury recommended death for Nelson. Nelson did not speak when she received the sentence, as she had previously denied the crimes leveled against her. Zamora pleaded guilty and served as a witness against Nelson in the case. He was sentenced to 27 years in prison. Zamora had testified that Nelson felt cheated because Smith predicted that Nelson's business would become successful if she moved from Orange County to North Carolina. Nelson moved, leaving her family behind, but things went from bad to worse for her. She even lost her house and was very bitter against Smith for the wrong predictions. During her hearing, Nelson maintained her innocence. She said, "My background was clean. Kill me, but do not dishonor me," Nelson said. "I need another chance." The judge was appalled that Nelson had no remorse for what had happened and said he found her actions laughable. She was convicted on February 16, 2010, and sentenced to death on April 23, 2010. She became the first woman to receive the death sentence in Orange County. Shauna Ford. State, Arizona. Date of sentence, February 22, 2011. In 2011, Shauna Ford, with two others, Jason Eugene Bush and Albert Gaxiola, invaded the home of Raul Flores Jr. and shot him and his family. Ford, while claiming to be officials looking for fugitives, gained entrance into the home of this family. They were members of Ford's vigilante group, the Minutemen American Defense. They had gone to Flores's home with the expectation of finding money and substances to sell to finance the vigilante group. The group patrolled Arizona's border with Mexico. On the day of the attack, Ford and her group were disappointed when they could not find money and substances in the house. They settled for the inexpensive jewelry they found and eventually shot Raul and his daughter. They also shot his wife 3 times and only left her when she pretended to be dead. After they left, she took her husband's handgun and called 911. While she was still on the phone, Ford and her group re-entered the house. She exchanged gunfire with them and wounded Bush in his leg. This made them run from the scene. The woman identified the intruders as 2 men and a white woman and identified Bush as the one who murdered her husband and daughter. They were convicted that year. Bush was sentenced to death while Gaxiola was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole plus 54 years. However, arriving at a death sentence for Ford wasn't easy. She was the leader of the group, but not the one who pulled the trigger. However, as the trial progressed, a picture of 9-year-old Brisenia Flores, whose life was brutally cut short, became a significant factor in arriving at that sentence. Before this case, Ford has had several run-ins with the law enforcement agents. She had served time even in juvenile lockups for repeated offenses like theft, burglary, prostitution, and many more. She became involved in vigilante activities in 2007 when she joined the Minutemen Civil Defense Corps. However, the group expelled her and she founded her own group. She was found guilty of all 8 counts she was prosecuted for on February 14, 2011. On February 22, 2011, she was sentenced to death. Kathy Sarinana, State, California, date of sentence April 2009. Kathy Sarinana and her husband, Raul Sarinana, were responsible for the death of their nephews, Conrad and Ricky, who lived with them. The couple had been caring for the boys while their mother served time in jail. However, the mother claimed to have requested custody of her boys, but Kathy said they didn't want to go to her. On a fateful day, the couple called 911 to report Ricky's death. They explained that he was refusing to eat and was punished for not eating. On that day, December 25, 2005, Ricky refused to eat breakfast, which his aunt saw as an insult. He was ordered to clean the bathroom, and when he was moving too slow, Sarinana kicked him. Raul threw him in the closet as punishment. When he tried to get out again, Raul kicked him. When he returned to the closet hours later, he was dead. The autopsy showed multiple external traumatic injuries. The report stated, scars on Ricky's body were consistent with being whipped with an electrical cord or similar instrument. Ricky's scrotum was damaged with a penetrating laceration, and his scrotal sac was severely damaged. There were multiple scars to Ricky's scalp, primarily centered on the back of his head. Finally, there were multiple circular injuries consistent with cigarette burns located throughout Ricky's body that were determined to be at least several weeks, if not several months, old. The next day after Ricky's body was found, investigators discovered his older brother, Conrad's body encased in concrete in a trash can in the carport. The couple had been charged in Washington for Conrad's death as he was killed there, about 4 months prior to the time Ricky died. The couple moved to California, where Ricky was killed. He was 11 when he was killed, and Conrad was 13. Raul and Kathy were found guilty of first-degree murder. In April 2009, a jury recommended them for the death sentence. Her attorney told the jurors that Kathy's husband abused her and was another victim, not an accomplice in the murder. However, in April 2009, she was sentenced to death. Socorro Caro, State, California, date of sentence, April 5, 2002. Socorro Caro was sentenced to death for killing 3 of her 4 children. In 1999, she had shot at her 3 children, Joey, Christopher, and Michael, while her husband Xavier wasn't home. They had an argument that night before Xavier left home. Caro's mother, Junta, who came around from time to help with the children, also left for her home that night. Before then, Caro had worked at Xavier's office as the office manager, but he had sacked her earlier that year. After then, she had expressed doubts about whether her husband loved her and was afraid he would leave her. When he left that night, Caro told her mom that he had left her with nothing. Then she said, "Well, I guess I'm crazy like he says I am." And Mom, he says I'm crazy. She called Xavier repeatedly that night, but he didn't answer. When he eventually answered, she asked him to come home. Xavier didn't return home until about 10:30 p.m. When he arrived, he found his wife lying on the floor with blood-stained froth in her mouth in their bedroom and thought she must have overdosed on her pills. He called 911 to report that, and when he rolled her over, he found a gun he had bought for her for self-defense with her. She also had bloodstains on her. While still speaking to the 911 operator, he went to check on his children and found Joey lying on his face without a pulse in him. He went to Michael and Christopher's room and found them lying together in the bottom bed with their faces ashen white. The baby GC, who was about 1 at the time, was safe in his crib. Xavier returned to the boy's room and found Christopher was not breathing, while Michelle was taking deep, gasping breaths. As a medical doctor, he tried to perform CPR, but lost Michael in the process. Caro was taken to the hospital that night, and she had to go through surgery. After she came out of surgery and was fit to talk, she claimed to not remember what had happened between her and her children. When she was told her children had died and she was responsible, she started crying. She said, "My babies. My babies. I'm sorry, I'm sorry." As the trial continued, Caro was sure she didn't kill her children as she had no memory of what had happened. On November 5, 2001, she was found guilty of 3 counts murder. The next day, she withdrew her plea of not guilty on account of insanity. On April 5, 2002, the trial court denied a motion for a new trial and a motion to modify the sentence. They sentenced Caro to death on each count of murder, with concurrent sentences of 25 years to life for the firearm enhancements. If you like the way we create these videos and you want us to bring more cases like this to light, please hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives.